This is the final episode of our Frankenstein season on Chapter by Chapter Classics, the short-form classic literature podcast where each episode walks you through a few chapters of a great book. Previously in Frankenstein, we stepped back to review the entire story, traced the main character arcs, highlighted the big themes, and flagged a few key differences between the 1818 and 1831 texts for exams and essays. And today, we're putting the two main versions of the novel side by side. All season long, we've been reading from the 1818 original edition and the 1831 revised text. In this episode, we'll step away from the chapter-by-chapter summary and focus only on how those editions differ. We'll talk about the prefaces, Elizabeth's background, Victor's sense of responsibility versus fate, how the creature's crimes are framed, and what changes in tone and detail between the two.
If you're listening to this, you've almost certainly read or at least, know the story of Frankenstein.
No, absolutely. It's a foundational myth.
Right, the ultimate tale of hubris, creation, consequence. But here's the thing, and this is a genuine aha moment for a lot of people. Most modern readers, maybe even you, have never actually read the book Mary Shelley first published.
And that's the crucial distinction we're digging into today. You see, the version of Frankenstein that, dominates classrooms and bookshops now is mainly the 1831 revision.
Not the original.
Not the original 1818 text, which is, it's a radically different beast. We're not talking about just a few grammar fixes.
Yeah.
We are talking about deep structural shifts that fundamentally change who Victor is, who Elizabeth is, and, maybe most importantly, whether the creature is a victim of tragic circumstance or just a pawn of destiny.
So for anyone who's really serious about the novel, knowing the difference between these two is, it's the difference between reading a philosophical text about radical human responsibility and reading a pure Gothic tragedy. So our sources today are custom tailored for this. We've got key excerpts from both the 1818 and the 1831 versions.
And our mission really is to pull out those key shifts. We want to show you exactly what's at stake when you pick one version over the other.
And we're going to start quite literally at the beginning. The front matter what Shelley uses to introduce her book is the first clearest signal of change.
It really is.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the huge contrast between that original preface and the leader introduction.
Right. So the 1818 edition was published anonymously, and it had this very concise preface, which was dedicated to her father, the philosopher William Godwin.
Okay.
And this preface, it treats the origin of life as almost an intellectual curiosity. It even states that the main event, the animation of life, was considered not of impossible occurrence by real-world figures like Dr. Darwin.
Or Erasmus Darwin, yeah.
Erasmus Darwin and German physiological writers.
So the 1818 preface is trying to ground the book in, quasi-science. It's saying, look, serious people are already talking about this. I'm just taking it one step further.
Exactly. The tone is detached. It's almost academic. The story's creation is attributed to a casual conversation during that famous rainy summer of 1816, inspiring a playful desire of imitation.
Playful. That's not a word I associate with Frankenstein.
Not at all. It treats the whole writing process as this neutral intellectual response to what was happening in science at the time.
But then we jump forward 13 years to 1831, and that entire framing it collapses.
It's gone. The revised edition replaces that preface with a sprawling, deeply personal, and reflective introduction written by Mary Shelley herself, now that everyone knows she's the author.
And she's writing it decades later, right? She's looking back.
Decades later, and she directly addresses the reader's question. How I came to think of and to dilate upon so very hideous an idea.
Hideous an idea that immediately changes everything. It's not about scientific speculation anymore. It's about a personal burden.
It is. She gets very specific, detailing the ghost story competition with Lord Byron and her husband, Percy Shelley, and she notes that those illustrious poets quickly gave up.
It sounds a little defensive almost.
A little, yeah. It's a very specific accounting of her own creative process, and that leads to the most famous part of the introduction, the description of the nightmare that inspired the whole thing.
The vision of the pale student of unhallowed arts.
Kneeling beside the thing he has assembled, and she later describes the novel itself as her hideous progeny.
That phrase, hideous progeny, just says it all, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It tells you everything about how she saw her own book later in life.
It really does. In 1818, it's this work of intellectual daring. By 1831, it's become this psychological weight she feels she has to explain, maybe even apologize for.
Which signals that the story's pulling back from the world of science and moving straight into the world of Gothic horror and personal tragedy.
And that psychological shift affects every single character. I mean, nowhere is that clearer than in Victor's domestic life. Let's talk about Elizabeth Lavenza.
Okay, this is where these subtle edits have just profound emotional impacts. Let's look at her origin story.
In the 1818 text, Victor's mother finds Elizabeth on a trip to Italy. And crucially, the text suggests Elizabeth is related. Victor always calls her my beloved cousin.
His cousin.
Yes. And his mother's goal in adopting her was, quote, to bind as closely as possible the ties of domestic love.
That feels, for the upper class society they're in, that arrangement feels like a very deliberate, almost financial and social consolidation of power.
Precisely. She's an intrinsic part of the family structure, there to bolster it. She's a pillar of the household.
Right. Now, what about the 1831 version, the one most of us know?
In that version, Elizabeth is presented as an adopted orphan from a much poorer, non-familial background. She's found in a little cottage in Italy.
So what does shifting her from cousin to vulnerable adopted orphan actually do for the story?
It immediately dials up the pathos of her situation. She's not consolidating the family strength anymore. She is this vulnerable external gift brought into Victor's life through his mother's charity. Ah, so when tragedy hits,
it's amplified. Because she's inherently more fragile, socially and emotionally. It fits that more fatalistic, melodramatic tone of the Resision perfectly. She becomes less a figure of domestic privilege and more a figure of pure, vulnerable innocence.
That is a powerful change. And if Shelley made the love interest more vulnerable, it makes you ask, what did she do to the protagonist?
Here's where it gets really interesting.
This is Victor himself. This shift is probably the most profound in the novel, changing him from a reckless genius who owns his choices to, well, a pawn of cosmic fate.
That's it, exactly. The 1818 Victor is the agent of his own destruction. He says his work ethic was ardent and eager, and when he finally sees the horror of what he's done, he accepts responsibility. He calls himself the author of unalterable evils.
He's a man of intellectual hubris in the original. He was in control of his own path.
Completely. But the 1831 revisions systematically add language designed to externalize that blame. Take the description of his change in studies after the lightning strike on the oak tree.
That pivotal scene. The 1831 Victor says his change in focus was due to some fatality. And then he says, destiny was too potent and her immutable laws had decreed my utter and terrible destruction.
Wait, he literally says, destiny did this to me. That sounds like a man running away from his own choices right at the turning point of his life.
That's the function of the revision. It makes him sound less like a scientist making a terrible choice and more like a Greek tragic hero being chased by the Furies.
I see.
And he doubles down on this. When he gets to Ingolstadt, the 1831 text says he was led to the professors by chance, or rather the evil influence, the angel of destruction, which asserted omnipotent sway over me.
An angel of destruction. That is extremely loaded language. It takes his story from a personal tragedy caused by bad choices into this epic struggle against a pre-written doom.
It absolutely does. It makes him a much more sympathetic, tragic figure.
It absolves him.
Subtly, but powerfully. Mary Shelley gave the 1831 Victor a vocabulary of victimhood, fatality, destiny, evil influence that the 1818 Victor, the author of unalterable evils, just didn't have.
And if Victor becomes more of a victim of destiny, what does that do to the creature, the instrument of that destiny?
Well, if Victor's made more innocent, the creature has to be made more malignant to justify Victor's hatred.
Right. So let's look at the creature's first major crimes. Murdering young William and then framing Justine for it.
Okay, in the 1818 creature's telling of the story, killing William is driven by a burst of generalized rage and exclusion. He sees the portrait of Victor's mother on William. It reminds him of his own ugliness, and he plants the portrait on the sleeping Justine.
And his motivation.
His stated motivation is that he learned how to work mischief from the lessons of Felix and the sanguinary laws of man. It's malice, yes, but it's a malice he learned from human cruelty.
Which kind of paints the 1818 creature as, at least theoretically, redeemable. His cruelty isn't innate, it's a response.
Precisely. But the 1831 edit makes the framing of Justine so much darker. It becomes deeply calculated, vindictive, and targeted. Shelley adds this specific, cruel psychological manipulation right before he frames her.
She adds a scene.
She adds a monologue. The creature approaches the sleeping Justine and whispers to her.
Whispering to her? That just sounds so much more evil than the generalized rage of the original.
It is. The creature whispers, Awake, fairest, thy lover is near, he who would give his life but to obtain one look of affection from thine eyes. My beloved, awake.
He's taunting her in her sleep before he frames her for murder. That's pure theatrical cruelty.
And then his internal thought in 1831 is, not I, but she shall suffer. The crime had its source in her. Be hers the punishment.
Wow.
That transforms the act from this desperate, tragic lashing out into a fully conscious, spiteful act against the very idea of human affection. By adding this, the 1831 creature becomes, without a doubt, a malignant devil.
Which then retroactively justifies Victor's intense fear and hatred of him.
Exactly.
It seems like almost every major change Shelley made serves this one goal: to separate Victor from the creature, making Victor less responsible and the creature more inherently evil. Which brings us to our last big point: the philosophical balance of the novel.
Which shifts radically. In 1818, the scientific grounding was robust. We mentioned the preface linking the event to Dr. Darwin and physiologists. The novel was written in the shadow of the galvanism debate, the idea that electricity could restart life.
So the original is asking the reader,
Yeah.
what if this could actually happen? What are the moral consequences?
Right. But once Victor is recast as the victim of destiny in 1831, the need to ground his work in real-world science kind of falls away.
The focus shifts.
The focus shifts from the intellectual possibility of creation toward the emotional, destined horror of the consequences. The novel retreats from philosophical speculation and becomes a more straightforward Gothic tragedy.
So if we step back and look at the whole picture, we basically have two different classic texts under the same name.
We do.
The 1818 text presents a much more challenging vision. It asks, what is the extent of human responsibility? It holds Victor accountable. He's the man of ardent execution who has to own the unalterable evils he created.
And the 1831 text asks a more comfortable question in a way. How does fate destroy a good man? It gives Victor the language of destiny that subtly absolves him and, at the same time, deepens the creature's malice.
Which is why scholars tend to prefer the 1818 edition. It's the intellectually tougher book.
It is, but the 1831 version is the one that became the standard. It makes Victor a more sympathetic, tragic, and less culpable figure, a choice Mary Shelley made, maybe reflecting the sorrows of her own later life.
Or maybe just to make the novel a more universally recognizable story of Gothic doom. It's a subtle shift, but it changed literary history.
That's the power of an author revisiting their own work. The revisions become the dominant text.
It's just fascinating to think about the motivation. If you read that 1831 introduction where she calls the idea her hideous progeny, does that emotional need to explain the dark themes to the world ultimately justify her decision to rewrite Victor into a less challenging, more palatable victim of destiny?
A great question.
That's something for you to think about next time you pick up Frankenstein. Maybe check the publication date in the front, see which version you truly have in your hands.
And that's our look at Frankenstein as two related but distinct books, the 1818 original and the 1831 revision. We hope this side-by-side season has helped you understand not just what happens in the story, but how different editions can shape our sympathy for Victor, the creature, and the world they inhabit. Thanks for listening to Chapter by Chapter Classics. If this episode helped you follow the story, follow the show in your podcast app so you don't miss the next chapter. And if you're enjoying the series, please take a moment to rate the podcast or leave a short review. It really helps other readers and students find the show. Remember, you can always come back to the overview episode or exam review episode for a fast refresher, or re-listen to any chapter breakdown while you read or review for an exam. New mini-series on other classic books are on the way, so stay tuned and subscribe to see which story we explore next. Until then, thanks for spending time with Frankenstein and for making classic literature part of your week.